You review a pristine lab dip for a new garment. The color is rich, the finish is flawless, and you approve it for production. But when that first bulk production run hits the water in a customer's washing machine, the color violently bleeds out. That failure is a lack of color fastness. Color fastness is a fabric's ability to hold its dye when exposed to washing, rubbing, sweating, or light. In global apparel sourcing, a failure to hold color is the leading cause of product rejection. This bar chart shows the financial reality of poor fastness. On the left, we have the small cost of an upfront lab test. On the right, we see the accumulated weight of shipping returns, platform penalties, and the total loss of unsellable dead stock. But implementing strict quality assurance isn't easy. It adds weeks to your timeline and creates friction with factory managers who want to push volume. For a sourcing manager, that presents a difficult return on investment calculation. Sourcing strategy relies on engineering enough upfront friction to catch and prevent catastrophic bleeding before the product leaves the factory. To build that friction, we have to look at the factory wet processing units. This is where the physical application of color actually happens on an industrial scale. The primary reason a fabric bleeds is poor dye fixation. This is a failure at the molecular level, where the dye pigment never successfully bonds to the fiber of the fabric. Factories operating on tight margins take shortcuts. They use low-quality dyes, or they rush the critical post-dye washing phase. When they cut these corners, loose, unbonded pigment is left sitting right on top of the fabric surface, ready to wash off on day one. Consumers do accept some natural wear. Slight fading over time and a gradual softening of the shade are normal, acceptable limits even for high-quality garments. Because natural fading over the life of a garment is inevitable, buyers have to build roadblocks during production. You have to stop those loose, unbonded dyes from ever making it onto the cutting table in the first place. The first roadblock is dictating exact chemical and dye matching. You cannot leave the choice of dye chemistry up to the factory. This flowchart illustrates the necessary chemical pairings for standard materials. If you are sourcing cotton, you must demand reactive dyes, which are formulated specifically to bond with cellulose fibers. For polyester, you require disperse dyes. Matching the chemistry creates a secure molecular bond. For heavy-duty garments facing harsh washing, you look to this third branch, that dyes. These provide maximum durability and lock the pigment deeply into the fiber structure. Dictating chemical precision comes with a direct trade-off. It strips away your ability to use cheap, off-the-shelf market fabrics and increases the base unit cost of your order. High-risk shades make this bonding challenge even harder. Take deep reds or solid blacks, and dark navies require massive amounts of pigment, increasing the likelihood that excess dye will fail to bond. Managing these dark colors requires bifurcating your production schedule. Dark fabrics require significantly longer processing and washing times than light pastels, meaning they move through the wet processing unit at a much slower pace. Dictating the exact chemical input secures the color at a foundational level. Sacrificing upfront production speed and flexibility is a necessary cost of doing business if you want the dye to hold. The second layer of defense is mandating pre-production lab testing. This must happen before a single yard of bulk fabric is allowed to be cut. At a minimum, you run 3 core tests. Wash fastness checks how the dye holds up in laundry. Rubbing fastness tests if color transfers onto other surfaces through friction. And water and sweat tests ensure the garment won't bleed onto the wearer's skin. Here is the rule for bulk approval. Never rely on initial lab dips. You must demand testing on actual dyed lot bulk swatches to prove the factory replicated the sample chemistry at scale. This quadrant chart plots implementation effort against risk mitigation. Pre-production lab tests sit firmly in the upper right, high effort and high impact. Inserting this phase adds 1 to 2 weeks of delay, and the financial trade-off expands from there. The process incurs third-party lab fees, adding direct overhead that strains the margins of smaller, budget-conscious production runs. But this delay and expense are deliberate. Lab testing is an engineered friction that catches unsellable, bleeding fabric while it's still just fabric, rather than after it's been permanently sewn in to thousands of garments. Once you have physical test results, you have to enforce them contractually. This eliminates subjective arguments with suppliers over what constitutes an acceptable color match. The exact industry standard written into your purchase orders must be a minimum gray 4 for wash fastness. Gray 4 indicates that any fading or color loss is slight and within acceptable commercial limits. Your secondary benchmark must require a minimum grade 3-4 for rubbing fastness. Anything lower, and the dye will visibly transfer onto the customer's furniture or underwears. To enforce these benchmarks, you use your most effective tool, capital. You legally link the final factory payment directly to passing these specific third-party lab results. Implementing this policy has an immediate consequence. It rapidly shrinks your pool of available suppliers, because low-tier factories simply will not take on the financial risk of a failed test. Tying hard benchmarks to capital forces the factory to internalize the cost of failure. It moves your sourcing relationship away from blind trust and toward verifiable, contractual compliance. The practical application of this playbook depends entirely on your specific business model. The right level of friction for one brand will bankrupt another. If you are a novice or indie brand, you are severely constrained by cash flow. You must endure the 2-week lab testing delay and pay the fees, because a mass return event from bleeding dye would wipe out your working capital entirely. If you operate in the fast fashion segment, your primary constraint is speed. You have to bypass heavy quality assurance on light pastels to hit deadlines, while strictly triaging and testing high-risk reds and navies. For the mid-level and premium segment, the constraint is scaling. You have to shift away from checking daily lab depths yourself, and instead focus entirely on enforcing grade 4 contracts and linking payments to independent lab results. Look at this matrix. These 3 distinct paths require sacrificing a different resource. You are either sacrificing time, agility, or the size of your supplier pool to mitigate downstream risk. No apparel sourcing model can evade the trade-off. Success relies on looking at your constraints and strategically choosing exactly where to apply the friction. Reliable color fastness requires a specific sequence of chemical and operational decisions throughout the manufacturing process. You cannot outsource accountability to a supplier. Doing so simply invites catastrophic shortcuts once the unstoppable momentum of bulk manufacturing takes over. In global sourcing, you will always pay for quality twice. You either pay upfront in testing fees and lost time, or you pay downstream in customer returns and destroyed brand trust. Accept the upfront friction of strict standards, laboratory testing, and linked payment terms. It is the single most profitable risk management investment you can make in your supply chain.